Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So today I wanted to discuss a change that's happening for 5th edition going forward that was announced in the recent Unearthed Arcana release. For those that don't know, Unearthed Arcana is playtest material for Dungeons & Dragons that's released by Wizards of the Coast roughly once a month, sometimes not that often, but the release it's followed up by a survey on the D&D website where players can give their feedback on the Unearthed Arcana material. This feedback is then used by the designers, or at least supposedly it is, to shape the official release. Unearthed Arcana can give insight into the direction the game is going, though personally the material in Unearthed Arcana is normally something I avoid, as it's normally not well balanced, and in my case, I find it inevitably leads to bias and sometimes disappointment, if and when the material is revised and released in an official book. When I analyze a new release, I want to be free of that bias and look at that release from a fresh perspective, which is why when I'm asked about recent Unearthed Arcana releases, I seldom have anything to offer. However, the most recent Unearthed Arcana grabbed my attention, not for the mechanics, but for a sidebar that discussed how the game would approach the matter of race in future releases. This wasn't playtest material, but a commitment to the readers. So let's go over what that commitment was today and discuss what it means for the game. But before we do that, some of the fans of this channel have decided to support my work through Patreon. If you would like to support this channel, a link is available in the video description. Get rewards like early ad-free video access or join me for a D&D session each month. Today I'd like to recognize some of my top supporters. John Cripps, Jonathan Haynes, Joshua Samuel Lappel, Kurt G., Lyric, Matt, Nick Lutz, Nick Simmons, and Philip Martin. Thank you so much for supporting me. Let's get started. So as I mentioned, the latest Unearthed Arcana included more than just playtest material. It also included a design note that read like a commitment from the designers about how race would be approached in 5th edition going forward. Here's what it said. In 2020, the book Tasha's Cauldron of Everything introduced the option to customize several of your character's racial traits, specifically the ability score increase trait, the language trait, and traits that give skill, armor, weapon, or tool proficiencies. Following in that book's footsteps, the race options in this article and future D&D books, so there's your commitment, lack the ability score increase trait, the language trait, the alignment trait, and any other trait that is purely cultural. Racial traits henceforth reflect only the physical or magical realities of being a player character who's a member of a particular lineage. Such traits include things like dark vision, a breath weapon, as with the Dragonborn, or innate magical ability, as in the Forest Gnome. Such traits don't include cultural characteristics like language or training with a weapon or tool, and the traits also don't include an alignment suggestion, since alignment is a choice for each individual, not a characteristic shared by a lineage. Finally, going forward, the term race in D&D refers only to the suite of game features used by player characters. Said features don't have any bearing on monsters and NPCs who are members of the same species or lineage, since monsters and NPCs in D&D don't rely on race or class to function. Moreover, DMs are empowered to customize the features of the creatures in their game as they wish. So there is a bunch of things to unpack here. First, let's discuss why these changes are occurring in the first place. And on this matter, I don't have a lot to say. From what I understand, it comes down to parallels some players have drawn between certain races in D&D and negative cultural stereotypes of people. There has been pressure for the game to distance itself from this kind of stereotyping, and the designers have responded with this commitment to do so. Admittedly, I haven't picked up on those parallels, but I'm not subject to those stereotypes, so I don't think I have anything useful to add to this part of the conversation. However, This distancing does affect mechanics, and affects mechanics in a significant way. And I do have some insights I would like to share on that. So let's break down these changes and discuss how changing the mechanics of the game in this way is going to change the future for Dungeons & Dragons. The first thing is that lineages or races that we see in the future will not have set ability score increases at all. It looks like the most likely scenario is a +2 and a +1 to put wherever you like. So this one is a big one, and I think we'll come back to it at the end, as it's the one I have the most to say about. The second is that races or lineages in the future will not have any traits that are cultural. This means no future race or lineage will have specific extra languages or extra proficiencies of any type. Now, although I understand why they're making this change, this does create an imbalance because of what is already published. Although you can trade extra languages and proficiencies from already published races to other languages or proficiencies, they still get them. So future races or lineages apparently are not going to get any at all other than a single language. And so this creates actually an unfortunate situation, because existing races are simply going to have more proficiencies than any races in the future will. In other words, any new races or lineages are less educated. I don't think that's what they were trying to accomplish here, but that is ultimately, mechanically, what is happening. Now, the easy fix here would be to add some floating proficiency slots to the new races, and they could simply fill them in to their preference, be it a tool or a skill. But if the 3 new lineages presented in Unearthed Arcana are any indication, that doesn't seem to be what the designers intend to do. This, however, still might be addressed before anything official is released, so hopefully it is. Not quite sure how that should look, though. Maybe just a tool and a skill proficiency. But then you have the issue that some existing races don't have these. Again, this creates an imbalance, and it creates the issue where cultural traits already exist in the game, and although you can float them, they still exist, and they have mechanical value. So you can't just take them away from future releases, or there creates an imbalance. I can't help but think that if we could rewrite the game, these traits could have been added to backgrounds, and then races could have been given something else to compensate. But that's too much probably to be done in an errata. The second change is that alignment is completely removed from race or lineage. As far as I'm concerned, this is a good move. Alignment, in my opinion, has always been an unnecessary mechanic that never makes the game better. If I wanted to play a good character, I don't need to write the word good on my character sheet in order for that to be the case. I can just role play it. This is a role-playing game. There doesn't need to be a mechanic involved, and frankly, I think it's better if there isn't. Think about it this way. Let's say you decide your new character has a quick temper. Does there need to be a mechanic for that? Does the DM need to determine if you are properly playing a quick-tempered character by their own views on what that means? Can't you just decide for yourself? Should there be magic items that you can or can't attune to based on how quick-tempered you are, or based on how quick-tempered the DM determines that you are? Do any of these things make the game better in any way? In my view, the role-playing portion of the game doesn't need mechanics. If I'm writing down a personality or moral or ethical trait of my character on my character sheet, that's really for me, to remind me of the concept I came up with for the character. I tend to find that role-playing that concept is its own reward, and it doesn't need a mechanic that rewards or punishes me. Now, whenever I express this view on this channel, I usually get some DMs in the comment sections explaining how rewarding or punishing their players on their views on how well the players are role-playing alignment is making their games better, so DMs out there, comment away. Though as of yet, I've not been persuaded, and I don't expect that to change. The final change going forward is the use of the term race. Race will now apply to player characters and the game features provided by the selection of race. Instead, the terms species and lineage are going to apply to monsters and NPCs. A parallel has been drawn to the term class. And if we look at the NPC stat block in the Monster Manual or similar source books, we can see that there are similarities between a class of wizard and the mage or similar NPCs, but the mechanics aren't identical. In a similar way, the selection of race for a player character may not line up exactly with the NPCs of the same species or lineage. Mechanically, this is already the case, of course. If you select a Duergar dwarf as your race and subrace, you get the ability to cast the Enlarge Reduce spell to enlarge yourself. But the Duergar in the Monster Manual use an entirely different mechanic to replicate a similar narrative. This, however, has now been specified. A DM is given a bit more freedom to decide if elves in their game world are resistant to charm, even if a player character elf is. So this separation already exists, and as far as I'm concerned, clarifying it doesn't really have any impact on the game itself. And then this brings us back to ability scores. So it appears that all new races or lineages will have a floating +2 and a +1 ability score to place wherever they want. After the release of Tashes, a floating +2 and a +1 is going to be very, very common. Now what this does mechanically, now that ability score bonuses are no longer fixed, is it adds a layer of complication to generating ability scores that adds nothing to the game. And that's unfortunate. I mean, if we were rewriting the game, the +2 and the +1 could have simply been added to the point buy, or to the stat array, or even to randomly generated ability scores by maybe doing a couple 5d6s and taking the best 3, or something like that. Instead, we're going to get to explain to a new player that they need to generate their ability scores using one of the standard methods, and then change the scores they just generated for no reason at all, after they pick their race. So there's just an extra step that doesn't need to be there. Now they could remove this step. All they'd have to do is say no race or lineage has an ability score increase at all, including the published ones, and then just change the ability score generation to provide some higher thresholds. Except that not all the same races get the same bonuses. +2 and +1 is the most common, but is not universal. Some races get +2 and +2. Others, +2 and 2 +1s, or only 1 +2, or 2 +1s. Removing racially tied ability score boosts provides a mechanical advantage to a selection like the variant human, and a mechanical disadvantage to a selection like the mountain dwarf. However, like with proficiencies, this also creates another issue where we have races that are simply better at ability scores, which means on average they are stronger, smarter, and wiser than the other races. Isn't this kind of the imbalance that these changes were supposed to remove? Now, I've long wondered why even bother with ability scores in 5th edition. It just seemed like an extra step. Why do we calculate whether we have a 12 or 13 strength when mechanically there's almost no difference? Strength could be simplified by expressing it as a modifier, as we express proficiency bonus. Do we really need to differentiate between a +2 dexterity from a 14 and a +2 dexterity from a 15? Now, I suppose the main issue in the existing game is half feats. Technically, a half feat shouldn't be providing a full +1 ability score modifier, but if it doesn't, then it's not as good as other feats. But this, I think, is an easy fix. We already call them half feats, so we could just make them half feats, as in you can select 2 of them, and there's no ability score increase included. Now, there are some minor mechanics that are tied to ability score rather than ability score bonus, things like jumping distance, for example. Again, this is an easy fix. You could just chart it based off the bonus, or maybe actually tie athletics proficiency into the jump distance. I mean, it doesn't really make sense that the skill is specifically tied to climbing, jumping, and swimming, but it does not have any impact on standard jump distances. And we could correct that easily enough as part of that step. But the rabbit hole started to get deeper as I started to think about removing ability scores, because then I started to wonder, do we even need ability score bonuses? Now, the first thought I had is, of course we do. I mean, it's one thing to say you're proficient in a weapon, but thematically the use of the weapon should be tied to the ability that the weapon requires, typically strength or dexterity, right? Except here's the thing. We have already completely abandoned those thematics in 5th edition. If your character wields a quarterstaff, what ability score should be tied to its use? The basic rules tell us that it should be strength, but because of class features, subclass features, and spells, it may not be strength at all. It might be wisdom, through shillelagh, for example, or dexterity, through monk weapons, for example, or intelligence, through battlesmith's battle ready, for example, or charisma, through hex weapon, for example. In fact, it might be any ability at all, except for constitution. Except that we are apparently now having melee attacks tied to constitution too, as we see with the Dampier in this very document. So there's no ability score that is thematically tied to weapon attacks at all. And this doesn't just impact weapon attacks. Now we see it going into other aspects of the game as well. For example, a high charisma makes you better at intimidation, though a lot of players will wonder why it isn't strength. And if you have a Fey Wandering Ranger, suddenly wisdom is a factor. So the "it doesn't make sense because the ability scores make you better at certain things" argument doesn't actually hold water when it comes to abandoning ability scores altogether, at least compared to the system we have now, because the ability scores are already pretty darn fluid. How a Hexblade uses charisma to swing a longsword harder, I mean, I'm not sure I get it, but if we think about it, we could probably come up with something. Maybe their force of will is what powers the blade, who knows? Why their strength no longer counts at all, again, who knows? But we're already there. The thing is, if we can explain that away, we can explain away why any weapon or skill could not be tied to a specific ability score bonus at all. And if no weapon and no skill is specifically tied to any ability score, then we don't need ability scores. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think we should replace them with anything. I mean, surely a fighter should be able to swing a longsword better than a wizard. But I think that is our answer. Add a proficiency bonus, and then another bonus. Maybe that's a class bonus. Maybe it's a specialization bonus. Or maybe it's a feat bonus. It doesn't really matter where it comes from, and frankly, just saying that a Hexblade is better at using longswords than a Fiend-Pact Warlock doesn't require that they tie charisma to that. In fact, it probably makes more sense if it doesn't. So what about saving throws? Well, honestly, I don't think we need a saving throw for every ability score. We used to use reflex, fortitude, and willpower, and those were tied to ability scores, but they were also tied to your class. Currently, we have dexterity, constitution, and wisdom saves making up the vast majority of saving throws. And most saving throws that are dumped under things like charisma could have been tied to wisdom thematically without any mental exercise at all, and both those things could be tied to something like willpower. And again, there's no reason why these saves have to be tied to a specific ability score. I mean, we could say that willpower, depending how we envision it, could be wisdom, but you know what? It could be charisma. It could even be intelligence. I mean, it could even be constitution. Or it probably makes the most sense for it to be tied to all of them to at least some degree. And if so, doesn't matter what those specific ability scores are, or couldn't we just explain it narratively? I'll tell you that D&D didn't always have saving throws primarily tied to ability scores. It used to be primarily tied to class, and that was pretty much it. There were certain ability scores that could affect certain saving throws, but most saving throws were you just had your class and your level, and you could go to a chart, and that was your saving throw. Again, this would be easy to do, and there is already an existing precedent in the history of the game. Now, I should say right now that I am not advocating getting rid of ability scores in 5th edition. They are so tied to so many mechanics of the game that I think getting rid of them would require a complete redesign of the game. I'm just saying it's something that could be done if that redesign were to happen. And I mention this because a couple months ago I suggested that D&D 5th edition was in its autumn. When we look at the direction the designers are going, it makes me think that 5th edition needs a rewrite more and more with every single change. There's no way the designers haven't noticed. I'll be interested to see what happens in the next couple years. However, for now, I'll keep with the current edition, and I'll keep speculating on what comes next, Speaking of what comes next, in my next video I'll be looking at Paladins, specifically the optional class features for Paladin in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, and our new subclass option, the Oath of Watchers Paladin. I hope you'll join me for that, and until then, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everyone, and I'll talk to you then.